Look at you listening to and watching a podcast. I'm Andrew. This is the Sound Legacy Podcast. My partner Paul is back there behind the camera, and we've got a fantastic episode for you today. A guest, his name is Gary Arndt. He is the host of the Everything Everywhere Daily podcast, but he's much more than that. He's a writer, an entrepreneur, an adventurer, a photographer, a polymath, a podcaster. He's a dynamic, interesting character. I don't know that I know many people like Gary. He's whip smart and has done podcasting almost literally everything. If it's happened at some point on the planet, he's either going to cover it or has done it already. Anyhow, we had a good conversation about storycraft and kind of what he's like as a guy. I enjoyed it. I think you will too. Thanks for watching this, by the way, or listening. If you're on some other platform, we really appreciate it. Feel free to visit mysoundlegacy.com to learn more about what it is that we do. And with that, I give you my conversation with Gary Arndt. Right. Got everything here. Where in the world are you, man? Are you?
I am in Appleton, Wisconsin.
Appleton, Wisconsin. I know literally nothing about Appleton, Wisconsin. You're not traveling at all at the moment?
I have not left the country in over 5 years.
Right.
Since the pandemic started, and more importantly, since I started the podcast.
Yeah. You're a busy dude, man. You are a busy guy. You got a team, or are you by yourself?
No one has ever helped me in any aspect of this podcast in 5 years.
Wow. How often are you saying that phrase?
Every time I do an interview.
Yeah.
Because I hear all these podcasters, and they have these huge teams, and I'm like, what the hell do they do?
Well, what the hell do you do, man? My God, how are you pulling this off?
I got a system in place. I mean, I've done it. I've done well over 1,000 episodes, so you just kind of figure it out after a while. I have a template for doing episode art. I kind of know, I got it down to a science at this point.
Sounds like it. Well, I want to talk to you about that. More just craft, not necessarily podcasting. Podcasting is a vehicle. The thing I'm more interested in is storytelling. And you've got a knack for it, man. Tell me, where did you learn to tell stories? Where'd that come from? Are you naturally a writer?
No, I did competitive speech and debate in high school and college. And in particular, well, I mean with both actually, but so I did an event in high school called extemporaneous speech, and I was in the top 10 in the United States my senior year in high school. And basically you draw a question at random, and you have 30 minutes to prepare a 7-minute speech. And the topics are usually things about what's ever in the news, some foreign or domestic thing that's going on. In debate, I did very well. I was in the top 10 in the United States my junior and senior year of college at the national debate tournament. And when you're doing that, you're doing a lot of speaking, and you have to explain things to people. So I think that's kind of where it came from.
Just explaining yourself.
Right.
I mean, did you have a love for it? Did you just love explaining yourself, or you just feel good at it?
I think it was something that I realized very quickly that I was good at this. Like, I ran track very early on in high school, and when I joined the debate team, I was like, yeah, I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Because this was something I could be really good at. And I talk about it on my show occasionally. It's skills that stick with you forever. Every day of my life, I'm using it. I know a lot of people who are high school athletes that the moment they graduate, they're just not athletes anymore.
Right.
And you get older, and, it's not to say there aren't valuable skills you learn, but it's not quite the same thing.
Yeah. Well, there's a big difference between hopping on a stage and explaining yourself versus writing it, the written word. And I mean, I'm assuming you're reading a script.
Yeah. So my very first episode 1, I thought I would do this like Dan Carlin and just riff and kind of do this off the top of my head. And 5 minutes in, I realized this is not going to work. I do not have the time to not. Have you ever heard the expression, I'm sorry I didn't have time to write a shorter letter?
Yes.
The time it takes to do it extemporaneously with all the editing and all the different takes you might have to do is longer than just writing the damn thing. And because I have to do this every single day, it was more efficient for me to write it than it was to do it off the top of my head.
Right. But before the podcast, you were blogging and writing about your travels and places you were going. So you've got sort of a muscle built up for
Yeah, but so blogging changed so much. When I started in 2007, blogging was social media. People would come to your website, they would subscribe to your RSS feed, they would leave comments. And all that got destroyed over time by Facebook, Twitter, and Google because the social media apps became the vehicle at which people followed you, and that's where they got information. And then before, even I would say 2018, 2019, before the pandemic hit, I was asking travel bloggers where they're getting their all their traffic from. And everybody was saying over 90% was coming from Google. And it's like, this is not sustainable.
Yeah.
If they change anything, you're dead. And I remember in the 90s, I had a company, it was a consulting firm, and I was in my 20s, and I grew this to 50 people working for me. And we had one client that was our biggest client. And that always scared the hell out of me because if they change their mind or if they do something, and we were a small company, and all it takes is some higher up to say, well, let's go with Deloitte or, some, McKinsey or some big company, which is not out of the question, we would have been toast. And thankfully I sold the company before that happened, but that's always a concern. And that happened last year in 2024. Google changed their algorithm and all the travel bloggers I know were just hammered. They lost like 80% of their traffic and it all started going to very big websites, which I was not at all surprised by, but I had shifted and pivoted over to podcasting. Podcasting is the last bastion of what the old internet used to be because there are no algorithms.
Yeah. Can you explain that? What you mean by that?
When you go to Facebook, you're going to see stuff, and that stuff is based on an algorithm of what they think you want to see. Reddit, Twitter, any social media, that they're serving you based on this algorithm. And in some ways that's good because their goal is to try to keep you on the app as long as possible to make money from you. But the problem is if you're an independent contract, you are reliant on those algorithms. So one question I get from almost everyone is, would you have a YouTube channel? And technically I do, but nobody watches it because I just upload audio files. But everyone on YouTube relies on the algorithm. And if the algorithm changes or the algorithm doesn't approve of you, you're dead. They can destroy they can shut you down, which happens at least once a month. I hear about some large channel that got shut down for nobody knows why. It wasn't even a controversial channel. It just got, closed. And another thing is that I know a lot of YouTubers who they're making videos and suddenly one does really well. And so they start doing more of those videos. And the next thing you know, that's all they're doing because that's what the algorithm wants, which was a far cry from what they were originally doing. And I've had people ask me, it's like, well, you should go to your analytics and see what episodes are the most popular and then do more of those. Problem is, there aren't any that are the most popular because people aren't listening to my episodes based on an algorithm. They're listening to it based on the fact that they subscribe to my channel and are getting everything. And as a result, because there is no algorithm determining what they see, there's an opportunity for serendipity, which almost doesn't exist online anymore.
Yeah.
The idea of just finding something by accident. And my show is very random.
Yes.
I violate every rule that podcasters are told of, what you're supposed to do. You hear everyone say, you got to niche down. You got to get a hyper niche. My show is literally called Everything Everywhere.
Yeah. Anti-niche.
But the randomness of my show is, I think, why people like it. Because you don't know what you're going to get the next day.
Yeah. It's funny. This will be released on Spotify. I do not use Spotify as a way to consume music or anything. I like record stores. I like a whole record. I like to just listen to a thing. I like spontaneity and, serendipity where you suddenly are turned on to a thing, which is one of the reasons I'm sort of attracted to what your show is that it doesn't feel algorithmic. So it's good to hear you explain that, the algorithm, pretty often. However, there are certain things that have run across my field of view that I appreciated from the algorithm that I would have probably not otherwise found.
But you've probably had this happen. Like you watch a video on YouTube and you're like, that was interesting. I watched a guy who was making leather shoes.
Mm-hmm.
But that was it. That was the totality of your interest. You're not interested in a life of making leather shoes. And all of a sudden, it's showing you all these videos of people making leather shoes.
Right.
And I don't want to see that. I saw this one. It was fine. No more, thank you. And there's no way to tell it like, okay, I'm good. You don't need to show me more leather shoe videos.
Yeah. And if you even just linger too long on a single thing that you did not intend on watching, it then feeds you that. I thought I recognized someone, I forget what it was, but then for like several months, I got these get ready with me videos of women in their 50s. Just like, I didn't ask for that. I didn't want that. But every day my feed was full of these people getting dressed for work.
And one of the reasons I don't like that is because I consume very little political content. And the reason is I know what they're going to say. I don't need to watch Fox News or MSNBC because I know what they're going to say.
Yeah, it's a pretty.
I would be watching it just to confirm, if you agree with them, it confirms your biases, I guess, and that makes you feel good. But if I know what someone's going to say, it's a waste of my time to sit and listen and watch it. If they're just gonna, reconfirm what I think that they're gonna say. So the only things I really want are things that are interesting, educational, things I don't know something about. That's me personally, but I've muted friends on Facebook because it's all they do is they post political content, and it's the same thing over and over. It's like, yeah, I know what the next thing you're gonna post is. I know it. I don't need to see it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, the things that interest you that you don't know anything about, how often are you using your podcast to learn new things?
Well, in the process of doing shows all the time, constantly. And it usually starts with like, that's interesting. So I'll be watching a movie, and this has happened a lot because I have a huge film collection. I'll be watching, it's like, this would be an interesting subject for an episode. Like I'll be watching The Great Escape or something, or I was watching A Bridge Too Far. And I was like, I've not done a show on Operation Market Garden. Well, I should do that. And I traveled from the beaches of Normandy to Berlin. I followed the path of the Allies in World War II. I went into the Netherlands and I visited a lot of these cities. I've been to Eindhoven. I've been to literally the bridge that was too far I've been to all these places. And I was like, why haven't I had an episode on this? So I threw together an episode on it that week. Other times I'll hear something that's like, well, that's interesting. And I have other episodes that take years for me before I really feel comfortable enough where I could get the story straight. So it's a process.
Yeah. So take me through, your week. I mean, you've got 7 days a week. You're putting out a show. Is it 7 or 5? It's literally 7, right? 7. Yeah.
But I do about 2 reruns a week.
Okay. That's where I was. So take me through a week. Do you have an outline, things you're trying to fill? Like how far ahead are you?
So tomorrow's episode is going to be on open source software. Today's episode was on mass extinction events, geologic history. I know roughly, so I've spent this morning, like as soon as last night's episode done, which I recorded at 3 a.m, I am thinking about, okay, what am I going to do for the next episode? And the biggest challenge is just mentally figuring out how I'm going to structure the show. So I haven't written it yet. I have my Google Word file opened. I think I've typed 1 sentence for the introduction. But I know it's like, okay, so we're going to talk about the origins of computing in like the 1950s and how the focus was on hardware. Hardware was what mattered. Everyone was focused on the hardware. And the software, quite frankly, they didn't have a lot of memory. So the programs weren't really that sophisticated. And people just openly shared software anyhow. Software was just like an add-on. People were buying the computers from IBM, and the software was just something, oh, here you go, you can have it. It wasn't until much later that software became a thing of value. And even in the 1980s, when like Microsoft went public, there were a lot of investors that saw no value in Microsoft because they didn't think that they didn't make anything, right? Oh, it's just ones and zeros. That's not a thing. The real value is in Intel or IBM that are making the actual computers. Well, it turned out that they're wrong. The only reason you have a computer is to run software. That's the value of it. A computer without software is meaningless. So anyways, and then you get into Linux and other things and different types of licenses and the difference between free software and open source software. So I at least have a rough idea of what I'm going to be covering, and I just need to really kind of sit down and write it. And it's Thursday, which means I am probably going to go to a local bar, and I'm going to sit at the bar with headphones and just write.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess where I'm trying to get my head around it, because, extemporaneous debate or discussion, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it benefits from a story arc if you can do that.
No,
But
there's always a story arc, even for things that don't have a story or don't appear to. So
right.
when you say storyteller or storytelling, a lot of people think like, oh, I'm telling the story of a woman who makes baskets in Peru. And I'm often telling the story of the element nitrogen or something like that.
Right.
And there is a story.
Of course.
Like no one knew nitrogen existed, even though it's all around us. It's most of the atmosphere. So you get into like, how was it discovered? And so and then you get into like, well, okay, it was discovered and what are its uses? What can we do with it? What experiments have been done? And so even though the shows are on many different things, there are different, I guess I've never actually sat and written it down, but I know like if I'm doing something on part of the natural world, like an element, that'll be a kind of a different story arc than if I'm doing a famous battle. In some ways, the battles are very easy to do because it's a linear story. And most of it, because my episodes are like, the body of a show of mine will be about 12 to 13 minutes long. Mostly when I talk about like a battle, I'm talking about the causes of the battle. Because with a very few exceptions, the actual movement of troops and stuff like that is the least interesting part of the battle. The question is, why did this happen in the first place?
Right.
And the only one I could think of where I really talked about what happened in the battle was the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal defeated the Romans and just completely wiped them out in one of the most brilliant maneuvers ever, where he surrounded them with a smaller force. Other than that, everything else is kind of the politics behind it and how things happen. A biography is similarly a relatively linear story of someone's life. It's a matter of picking what's the important parts.
But you picking those parts when you want to tell a story that isn't strictly linear, like say, for instance, nitrogen, there are any number of ways that you could approach that story. Like you could talk about that having been a fixed number at one point on the planet, and suddenly we figured out how to synthesize it by making weaponry. It was an accidental thing. I mean, that's a whole other arc.
You're talking about the Haber-Bosch process.
Yeah.
That was fixing nitrogen.
Right.
Which I've done an episode on Fritz Haber and how he was both the best and worst chemist in the world. He developed this process which allowed us to create fertilizer, which feeds most of humanity. And then he also created like mustard gas and was in some parts responsible for Zyklon B that was used in concentration camps. So he also did these horrendous things with chemistry.
Right, but so I use that as an example. So that's it's a story about nitrogen. If in fact nitrogen is the story, that's another arc you could take. So when you're picking how you're going to discuss any given topic, how are you doing that? Is that just your own personal views?
You got to make choices. And because I do a daily show, always, I do this a lot, say this will be the subject of a future episode. I call it zooming in and zooming out. So, for example, if I'm doing an episode on nitrogen, that's kind of a high level thing where I may mention the Haber-Bosch process and ammonium and things like that. But then I'll zoom in another episode and just talk about that. Or I'll just talk about, and I do that quite frequently because I did an episode once, which is probably one of the highest level things I did. Like I did the history of the Mongol Empire, which is a lot to cover. And you're going to leave a lot out. And you're talking at that point about painting with a very broad brush across history. It's like the Mongols moved into Russia and then they moved into Iran. And you're skipping a lot of the major battles and things that happen. But I can then subsequently go back and look at this particular battle or the siege of Baghdad, which was one of the most, horrific things that has ever happened in human history in terms of a loss of life that you could mention in an episode like that, but you're not really going to focus on. And so that process, and because I always know there's going to be another show and I always need content, the fact that I can go back and either zoom in or zoom out on a topic is pretty good. And a lot of times I'll have a show idea and I'm like, well, I should do something. I should do a higher level show first. So I wanted to do one on the Underground Railroad. And then I was like, well, I should do one on the abolitionist movement first, Then I'll do the Underground Railroad movement. Then I'll do one on Frederick Douglass, and I'll do one on John Brown, and like that. Yeah, it's
Yeah. I don't get the sense in talking to you that it gives you any anxiety.
no.
Do you? Yeah.
The only time I have anxiety is if I wake up and I don't know what today's show is going to be, which happens more than I would like to admit.
I can imagine.
I did a rerun on March 31st, and I took the day and I just figured out what I was going to do for half of April. And that puts me at ease because I at least know then,
Right.
even if I take a day off, I at least know what the next show is going to be.
Did you have journalists, heroes? Were you like a journalism into writers? No. This it's just such, it's so interesting because you're doing journalism. I mean, you're doing history and journalism and all this stuff. You weren't like a Dan Rather fan or like a
So when I started my blog, it was a travel blog. 2010, I became the first blogger ever to join the Society of American Travel Writers, which was like the premier, still is, the premier association for travel writers. And I got to know, and I was and I learned a lot from being around these people. So I got to know a lot of people who were editors at major newspapers. A good friend of mine was the travel editor at the San Francisco Chronicle. I know the woman who is the editor of Miami Herald, the LA Times. And I just got to know a lot of these people. And one of the interesting things is I came at this, like my background was an entrepreneur. They were writers and they went to school for writing. And my approach to this was completely different. And I realized that the Romans had a thing called the cursus honorum, which was a series of positions you could be elected to. And it went from lowest to highest, and they had age requirements. And the highest was to be elected consul. And I realized that there was the same thing in journalism. Like you go to school and then you get a job at a crappy paper, and then hopefully you get a job at a nicer paper, and then, you wind up as an editor, and then maybe you get something at like the New York Times or the Washington Post or something like that. And that was kind of their ladder. And I realized a blog isn't even on the ladder. Like that is at no place. So they didn't recognize or respect what I did. And then I would hear them complain about how none of them are making any money and the newspapers were shutting down. And I'm like, I'm doing okay. And I spent the better part of a decade trying to tell people like, entrepreneurial journalism is going to be the future. And if you look at Substack now,
yeah, that's
kind of where it's at. There are people there making well into the six figures and a couple in the seven figures annually, but they just, yeah. So I kind of washed my hands of the whole thing.
Yeah. It's just interesting to be, I mean, you're particularly curious for an entrepreneur. Not to say to suggest that entrepreneurs aren't curious. I mean, but it's usually a very narrow focus, for an entrepreneur. They're after a certain outcome. Are you?
Well, that's not curiosity. I think that's just they're driven to try to succeed in whatever field they chose. I think when I first started my business, it was more by accident than anything else, to be honest. I didn't really go into it. I don't think children grow up wanting to be a consultant, which is what my firm was. And when the opportunity, I managed to sell it before the dot-com bubble burst.
Nice.
So, and I was kind of happy to do it because again, it was one of those things where I was like, yeah, I was doing it and it was doing well, but it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to be doing. And when I came up with the idea to travel around the world, that was something I embraced, and I managed to turn it into something because I did have the entrepreneurial background, but basically traveling was a way for me to, scratch my curiosity.
Did you want to do when you were a kid? What was the thing that you thought you might be doing?
Probably be an astronaut.
All right.
I would go through phases where I would learn about everything about a subject. I knew everything about baseball. I could tell you every member of the 500 home run club, the 3,000 hit club, things like that. Then I deeply got into like NASA stuff, and I would, kids would go to lunch. I would go to the library and read books about the Apollo program and the Gemini program, and could tell you the names of all the astronauts that had gone into space at that time. And I think a lot of that has kind of, very circuitous way it kind of paid off to where I am and what I'm doing today.
Yeah. How's your recall for the things you write about? Can you keep that in your brain, or like a lot of journalists, they'll get very deep into a subject, rice farming in a certain part of Southeast Asia. They'll know everything about it. And then on the next assignment, they can't remember any of it. Is that happening to you, or are you
No,
pretty
I'm
present with it?
pretty good. Sometimes I may have to just like look at the script of an episode for like 30 seconds and it'll be like, okay, yeah. And that's really kind of what it'll take.
What do you want out of this? I mean, I know it's a business for you at this point, but what do you want for people to get out of what you're doing?
So when I started the podcast, the reason I started it was desperation. The pandemic just killed me because all of travel and tourism shut down. And I went in a 2-week span. Well, in March of 2020, I came home from my last international trip. I got COVID, and then the bottom fell out on everything in travel, and I needed to do something. And I realized from what I had mentioned before about the problems in blogging with Google, and I felt podcasting was the best way to reinvent myself. I had an idea for a show a few years earlier. I got the artwork done. I had the theme music. I paid for the rights for it, all of which are what my current show is. The only difference is the original idea was for doing longer episodes less frequently, like a 2-hour episode once every other week. I shifted to doing it daily simply because I had a lot of time on my hands and I felt it was a better business strategy. That was my primary thought of doing this. And that it was a way for me to use 13 years of traveling around the world. You put that experience into the show, but I didn't have to, it didn't have to be about travel. Because one of the things I realized is that most people don't care about travel until they're about to go on a trip. You don't follow it like you do sports, news, technology, fashion, gossip, whatever. So I wanted something that people could listen to all the time and not just before they wanted to go on a trip. So that was the impetus for the show. But as I started doing it, I started getting feedback from people, the likes of which I had never gotten before, where parents would write to me and say, you don't know this, but you are our 11-year-old's favorite teacher. I would get it from truck drivers. I spend a lot of time behind the wheel and I listen to your show all the time. People from all walks of life and all ages that were listening to it. My show is not a children's show, insofar as most children's show pander to children. Hey kids, we're going to talk in a voice like this about this topic. I don't do that. The show is clean. I do not swear. And the caveat I always give is that it's as clean as history will allow. Meaning that there were some events in history that were pretty horrible, and I occasionally may have to mention them, but those happened, and your kids are going to have to learn about some stuff anyways. I'm not doing sex education or anything like that, but bad things happened. And I wasn't thinking of kids when I was doing this show. The decision to keep it clean and to never talk about politics was really a strategic decision on my part because I had seen so many podcasts I thought failed because of that they were just killing themselves because they consistently went off topic, or they were, the humor and the content and the language wasn't helping them any. The people who listened could put up with it, but it's not like anybody went out of their way to listen to it for that reason. And it's kind of paid off in spades. It's an accessible show for lots of people. I get people all over the world that listen to it. And it'll never be the most popular podcast because I think most people are not curious.
Yeah.
But for those people who are, and they come from every walk of life, this is something for them.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. It is for the curious. You have to be, you got to be up for it. It is, I think it's very well done. Obviously, I mean, I wouldn't want to have you on here if I didn't think it was great, but I do, it just seems like there's more to it. Like when I think about history, we tend to, particularly, I mean, I live in Northern California, so the veneration of the ancients is really popular. People always want to, talk about how noble and amazing all the ancients were. But it's like, and that this modern man is somehow a perversion of that, great vision. But we came from history. We are the result of whatever those people were up to.
I mean, that's basically a version of the noble savage myth, that everyone was peaceable beforehand. And if you look at the histories of a lot of native peoples in North America, they had wars all the time.
Slavery.
They were fighting
wars.
constantly.
Yeah, just not.
And somehow, when people interpret history like that, they usually do it for reasons of gaining some sort of political currency today.
Mm.
That's why they do it. It's not because they really care about the past. It's that they can try to get some mileage out of it, I think. And it's true everywhere. You can find bad things that happened in every point in history. Slavery I remember going up to, this was in British Columbia, and I was on Haida Gwaii, which are the islands off of northern British Columbia. And I was talking to some of the native people there that do fantastic artwork. Have you ever seen the Seattle Seahawks logo? That's kind of a Haida design. And they were saying like, oh yeah, we enslaved the local tribes. This is before Europeans ever showed up. And they were like, oh, but they liked it because we treated them so much better than, and I'm like, I'm guessing that they didn't think that.
Yeah.
Because if that was true, you wouldn't need to enslave them.
Right. Yeah. That's called employment.
And so you can find this everywhere.
Yeah.
In Africa, the reason why the slave trade started is because the Europeans just tapped into what was already happening. If you've ever seen Roots, there's a scene where Kunta Kinte is caught in the bush by a bunch of white men. That almost never happened, simply because Europeans were afraid to go deep into Africa because of malaria and other diseases. So they had working relations with various groups, and they did the capturing for them, usually from tribes that they were at war with.
Well, I guess the reason I was bringing up the, that we are the product of history. You do a great job of contextualizing. I hate to say everything, but everything that you're touching, it's more than just a story arc, more than just good telling of a story. It's to contextualize it, to help you see it from seems like a fairly clear-eyed view. Is any of that in your hope for your show, is to give people some as close to objectivity as you can get? Is there any of that sort of thing in your hope?
Yeah, I mean, I don't try to sugarcoat things or put a spin on it. I have no particular agenda I'm trying to push. Everyone who believes in something, no matter what it is, if it's a political philosophy, you're going to find some people who agree with you who did horrible things. And that's always an uncomfortable thing with people because, well, they try to whitewash it or sweep it under the rug or pretend it didn't happen because, well, if this person who agrees with me did something bad, then it looks bad on what I believe. Therefore, I'm going to try to minimize what happened. And you can't do that. And I think a simple acknowledgement up front, like, yeah, I agree with this one person. Hitler was a horrible person. He also made the Autobahn. Eisenhower took the Autobahn idea, adopted it into the interstate highway system, even though 99% of what he did was pretty horrible and was responsible for damn near as many deaths as anybody in human history. You could take one thing from it. And likewise, you could say, yeah, I can agree with someone on something, even though, and it gets into, even in things of like art. There were composers like Wagner, who was a horrible anti-Semite. And there's an excellent documentary that Stephen Fry did about this. Stephen Fry is Jewish and loves Wagner. And so he did a documentary where he tried to resolve these two things by attending the annual Bayreuth Festival in Germany, where they perform Wagner and come to terms with this. It's like, how can I like someone who hated me for who I am, yet created such wonderful music? And I think that's just part of life. And we try to, like I said, people try to make these things go away, but they're there.
They're there. And I just appreciate anybody who's just, telling the story of what happened without opinion, without asking you to come to a conclusion other than here are what the facts were. Here's how we contextualize. To be able to see what is coming in our future, clearly you have to understand what happened in the past.
And there are times where we don't know what happened, or there are conflicting stories as to what happened, or conflicting interpretations. That's also a thing.
Yes.
One of the things that I find interesting is, like, there's been a reassessment of the Emperor Caligula. If you know the name Caligula, it probably is not associated with anything good. There's not a whole lot of histories from the ancient world that have survived. 99% of everything that was written down from, say, ancient Rome is gone. So what survived were things that were written by people who didn't want to tick off the current emperor. And so if a previous emperor fell out of favor, they may write more harshly about that person. And I think that's true. people can make those criticisms and say that, these were done with some sort of, they weren't objective. And I think that's a very valid criticism. So a lot of people are now saying, well, those things, the rumors about him never really happened. And that might be true, but we don't know it's true.
Right.
They're putting an interpretation on something.
Yes.
And it's an interpretation, like I said, that might be true. There's an argument. I can see why, because some of the things were so outlandish that they're hard to believe. But then again, someone with absolute power is precisely the person that would do something so outlandish.
Yeah. Yeah. If it can be done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're good at posing the question in the telling of the story. Saying I don't know is a perfectly valid answer that I wish more people would say. I feel like our culture at large suffers from sort of an epidemic of certainty, and your way of saying, hey, here's what we think happened, here's how we think it went down, I think it's worth sharing, and it's worth people paying more attention to that nuanced understanding of history. And I know you're not just a history show, clearly, but I think what you do with history is particularly interesting to me.
Well, everything has a historical component to it. So even if I do an episode on, say, math or science, I always include the origins of well, how do we know this? Because a lot of times you'll just hear on the news well, scientists say, as if that's good enough. Right. And the reasons why they know things, it can get very technical if you get into the weeds. But at a high level, you can say, well, they looked at the dirt and they were able to measure the the isotopes of whatever various elements that are in there and measure the age of something. And that's how they know this. Or the telescopes can look at the redshift of light, and that's how they know the age of the universe. But I did an episode within a month on why is the alphabet in alphabetical order?
Yes.
And at the end of the day, the answer was we don't know. But we know that it's been that way a very long time.
Yes. That
the alphabet we use in English came from Rome, which came from Greece, which came from the Phoenicians. And you can look at the Phoenician alphabet and pretty kind of see it's the same order, and it hasn't changed. So there's theories about it that I discuss, but there are certain things that are so far back in time that we don't know. We'll never know.
Right. But asking the unanswerable question is how you find out. That's how you get innovation. That's how interesting things happen. That's why we have, synthesized nitrogen. Someone asking a horrible, weird question or possibly unanswerable, the MRI machine, space travel, all these things came from asking other questions that are, I guess what I'm getting at is what you do well is even asking a question, why is the alphabet in alphabetical order, is the sort of thing that I think you're doing well and will benefit many people. You're already getting a lot of downloads. A lot of people are listening to your show, but I hope more do. And I hope, especially kids, I think it is, I know you're not gearing it towards kids, but it's the kind of thing you would hope for from a teacher.
I think the reason why kids like it is because it's not for kids.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't know about you, but growing up, I never went to a teen center because teens don't want to go to a teen center.
Yeah.
Growing up, I wanted to go to a nightclub or a bar or something,
right,
that adults did because everybody wants to be a grown-up until you're a grown-up and then you want to be a kid.
Right. Didn't know
so by not talking down and making it a kid's podcast that they're listening to the same thing that adults do, I think is actually more appealing to kids, especially smart ones.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got plenty going on. You're going to hopefully saddle up to a bar here soon yourself and start writing. But before I let you go, what's the future here? What do you see for humanity, having been such a student of many cultures, many lands, and a lot of history? Where are we heading? Are we getting smarter? Are we getting dumber?
It depends on what you define as that. One of the problems is that we're not reading as much. I have friends who are teachers, and there are certain things that every generation goes through, and our parents don't understand us, and we went through the same things. And you could even go back in Roman history and find people complaining about the way they wore their hair or they wore their togas in a certain style. That has been with us forever, and that always will be. But there is something different today, and that's technology. Especially if you look over the last 15 years or so, in the last decade, smartphone adoption has increased, and that is always with you all the time. And we were always restricted by reality in terms of the number of people we could communicate with. Even with the telephone, It allows us to communicate with people further away, but it was still like a one-to-one communication. And now what the internet and social media have done has so disrupted how we normally communicate that is causing a lot of problems. You're seeing increases in depression across the board amongst younger people. They're having a very difficult time focusing. They can't consume or create long-form content. So that's a problem. I think that people are starting to figure it out. There are more schools that are banning smartphones in schools, which I think is a good idea. The overwhelming issue that's going to be facing humanity over the next century is going to be depopulation. Birth rates are falling, and just as increasing population defined the 20th century, we're very close and may have already passed peak humanity in terms of the raw number of people. Seeing some compelling evidence that the number of people in China has been exaggerated grossly, that there may in fact be less than 1 billion people in China. And that's several hundred million people just taken off the rolls of the number of people. And it has to do with a bunch of things, including the government trying to inflate numbers to make them look good, regional governments trying to get more funding, things like that. And there may be a smaller but similar thing in Nigeria. But in a world where we've never experienced this as a species. When there's been decreases in population, it's usually been through war, famine, disease, natural disaster, or something that was like that was kind of across the board. And now we're going to have a world where the median age is very old. Like in South Korea already, it's like into the 40s.
Yeah, the pyramid, the flip of the pyramid.
And so you have a smaller number of young people that are supporting a greater number of old people. And there's fewer people in the next generation to have children, which means that if they were to keep population at the same level, they would need to have even more kids, which nothing appears to be going in that direction. And people don't realize if, replacement level is 2.2 children per female, if it's down to 1, that means that every generation is half the size of the previous generation. And that can drop faster than it grew. So you're looking at that is a huge fundamental change. And then economically, around the world, almost every developed country and most undeveloped countries are having enormous problems with debt.
Yes.
Debt, there's more debt in the world than there is money, which is astonishing. And there's no way the United States government can pay its debt. There's just no way. And so, we're already spending $1 trillion 100 days. That is only going to increase. The Social Security Trust Fund, which is all in government debt, is now starting to go down and will probably be exhausted within 12 years. Plus all the pension plans and everything else, which is going to be, just magnified by the reduction in population. So yeah, those are the big things. I don't know what you do about those.
So hopeful or no? You got hope?
Have you ever heard of Stein's Law? Stein's Law says, I'm a big believer in it. If something can't go on forever, it won't. So there will be a point where population rates will go up again. What may eventually cause that to happen from between that point and this point, I don't know. That could be bad. Another interesting thing, people giggle when I say this. In 200 years, there will be 300 million Amish people in the United States. If you live in a large urban area, you do not encounter Amish people, ever. There's something that you may have heard of on the internet or see on TV or something like that. I can tell you in rural Wisconsin, there are way more Amish today than there were when I was growing up.
Really?
There's a lot more.
Yeah.
And they have very large families, and they are growing rapidly. And it's just math, right? The people that have children are the ones that are going to, it's not the meek that are going to inherit the earth. It's the fecund.
It's the breeders.
So again, I don't know. Something in the future could change that, but these are big term trends over 100 years. And if you were to talk to someone in the 19th century and show them life 100 years later, would they say it's good or bad? Right. Yet a lot of the people in the 20th were complaining about how awful it is, and people complain about how awful it is. All things being equal, we live in a world of science fiction compared to people 200 years ago. They can't even fathom it. If you showed Benjamin Franklin an iPhone, the thing that would have amazed him isn't the GPS or anything else. It's the fact that it produced light.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And life is so easy for us that I think a lot of the problems we have are actually a result of the fact that we live easy lives.
Yeah.
That if you suddenly lost everything and you have to spend all day chopping wood or cooking food from scratch, and by from scratch, I mean skinning a squirrel, you don't have a whole lot of time to dwell on the problems in your life. I don't know. I'll be dead before those things happen, so I'm not too worried about it.
That's a good place to end a podcast, man. You know what you're doing. I really appreciate you, Gary. I know you're a busy guy. I mean, for you to do this, this is a new venture for us. We're focused on storytelling, family stories, that sort of thing. And this is early days in our podcast. So for you to take the time and come talk to me is very generous of you. And I appreciate what you're doing with your work, and the way you do it, I think, is very valuable. So cheers to you, man.
No, it's my pleasure. Always happy to talk.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're everything, everywhere, daily. We're you sending people to your website? Do you care if people go to your website?
However they listen to the show, I don't care.
Yeah.
I usually tell people, wherever you're listening to this podcast right now, go
you
search
go.
for Everything Everywhere Daily.
Yeah, great. Okay, man. Well, cheers. If we can ever be of assistance, you know where to find us.